Okay, so today we're going to be continuing our message series in Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, depending on which Bible you're using. If you're using the Pew Bible in front of you, it's going to be called Song of Songs. We're going to be in chapter 5, which is page 675, so I want to encourage you guys, go ahead and turn there. And while you're turning there, I just want to share a story that I think relates to the passage today. I don't know what you guys had as your first car or when you got your first car. Some of you might be still dreaming about having a first car at some point in the future. But for me, the first car I regularly got to drive was a 1983 Honda Accord that my father had. And it was not the flashiest car. You know, as a sophomore in high school, I was one of the first kids in my class to actually get my license and be able to drive, and so I was excited about that. But this car, it had some quirks to it. One of them was that the paint job had faded so much that if you leaned against this car, then you got a maroon paint job too. Just lean against it, and the paint would just rub right off. So you had to be really cautious about that. But another thing was, this car at some point in its history had been involved in a rollover. And so the roof of the car had gotten crushed, but they'd straightened it out. And rather than really just get it all flattened out right, they figured out that you can just use gallons of Bondo and get the job done that way. And so they put in this body putty, and over time, the paint that they'd put on it had faded away, and there was a bunch of cracks and rifts in the roof of the car. It looked like scales on a reptile's back or something like that. And then on top of that, this car, to add to the embarrassment, it had a third gear in it that when you shifted through in the stick shift, you get to third gear, and if you let go of the shifter knob, then inevitably it would jump out of third gear, and it would make that hideous grinding noise that maybe you've heard before from a stick shift when it doesn't quite go in right. So when you got to third gear, you had to hold it in place, and then once you got to fourth, you could actually let go of the shifter knob. And I remember thinking of, my father had some of these big, beefy farm trucks and stuff like that, and I always thought, why couldn't I be driving one of those? That'd be so much better. I'd rather be driving that 1930s monstrosity than driving around in this little Honda Accord. And the Honda, the interesting thing about it was, for how rough it was, and for how beat up around the edges it was, you couldn't kill that car. It would run forever. And between the scaling on the roof and the unkillableness of it, my friends nicknamed the car the cockroach. That's what they would call it. And so they'd get in, slap the roof, come on, let's get the cockroach going. And these poor guys, I was the only one they knew in our class who could drive, so they were stuck with me in that car. But we'd drive all around in it, and never once did that crazy car actually leave me stranded. In spite of all of its issues and its 300,000+ miles, it was a good, reliable rig. It always got me from A to B, which is typically what you want a car to do, in my experience. I eventually got a different car, and I thought I was making a really wise decision. I had the opportunity to buy really cheap a 1988 Chevy Beretta, and I thought, oh, this is good. V6 motor, so much more power, and it looked nicer. 5 years newer, so, this is practically new, and only like 13 years old. And then, and so I get this Beretta, and I have to say, it felt like every time I started that car, I might as well just throw a $100 bill out the window. That's how much money it took to keep that stupid car on the road. It had around 200,000 miles, and I didn't realize that for an 88 Chevy Beretta, 190,000 is about as long as you should probably push your luck. You should probably just give up on it then. And so I no matter what I did in that car, it just always seemed to have issues. The first year I owned that car, I spent more than $2,000 just trying to keep it on the road. And I wasn't a mechanic then, but I went to all of our family friends who were mechanics, and I would just beg them, help me. I need to figure out, how do I replace this? How do I fix this? And they'd help me out, and that's part of what made me realize I better learn to be a mechanic, because I can't afford to drive this car unless I have that profession in my repertoire. But that car, it was a lot like a barge. It was really reliable if another vehicle was pushing it around. That was okay then. And I don't know, I mean, in a 6-month period, I must have made like 6 different phone calls to friends, calling them. So oftentimes, I'd be going to the game and then go run a friend home in my Beretta, and then I'd have to call another friend and say, hey man, can you come get me? My vehicle's broke down again. In fact, I had a buddy with a 76 Dodge Power Wagon, and it had about 5 gallons of Bondo putting it together. That thing would never stop running, and it was constantly dragging my Beretta back to where I could go spend hundreds more dollars keeping it going. Now, the interesting part with all of that, of course, was my first car I despised. I really didn't like it at all. I was ungrateful and unhappy I had it. But it always got me from place to place, and it never left me stranded. And the whole time I owned it, all I could think about was how I wish I had something different. And about the time I got something different, I started to realize, boy, I was better off with the Honda. In fact, frequently, I'd still be driving the Honda to school because the Beretta was waiting to be repaired of whatever ailment it had that week. Now, all right, we have an anti-Chevy fan here, so yeah, but fair enough. So anyway, I don't know how many of you guys have had an experience like that with your vehicle. What I want to point out is, sometimes we have experiences like that with our car, and we have a good car, and yet we tend to think the worst of it. But I want to suggest to you today, sometimes we actually act similarly with our relationships. Whether it be our friendships or our marriages, sometimes we have a good thing right in front of us, but we focus so much on the little broken scaly bits that we can't see the blessings that are actually there. And in today's passage, we're going to see where that principle bears some fruit out, and it bears some bad fruit in the relationship of our young couple in the Song of Songs. So as a reminder, as we go into our passage today, in this book, we're talking about one of the books that talks about love and sex and intimacy more than any other in the Bible. I know these are kind of taboo subjects, but we bore through it so far, and nobody has had a cardiac event as a result of it, so that's good. And as we've gone through this, we've seen a young couple who first starts falling in love with each other. They're very much becoming infatuated for each other in this courting phase, and eventually they come to a point where they have a bit of a fight, which leads them to realize, wow, I really value this relationship. I think this is the person I should marry. And so they make that decision. We saw them in chapter 3 become married. And in chapter 4, the last chapter that we read, we saw them for the first time experiencing sexual intimacy with each other. They were seeing each other for the first time in that way. And going into that experience, as chapter 4 ends, we see the woman in the relationship inviting the man into that. And as chapter 5 begins, we'll actually see the final few verses of that interaction happen. Now, before we go into chapter 5, I just want to warn you, chapter 5 will begin, in effect, with the end of chapter 4, but then we're going to start up from there, and we're going to start to talk about a separate event that happens down the line. And I'll describe that to you as we go through it, but it'll be helpful to keep that in mind. I also want to mention, just as a reminder to everybody, that when we go through Song of Songs, it's almost as if we have a script that's present, but the characters aren't named, and the plot is not explicitly given. And a big reason that this book is that way, I'm going to propose to you, is because the story that we're reading through is a story that could just as easily be ours. It's the story of romance, of intimacy with one another, and it not only speaks truth to dating relationships and marriage relationships, but it also, we'll see there'll be some effects even on friendships that we can learn from this. But we can put ourselves in these people's shoes, I think, more easily as their descriptions are kept somewhat vague. And so as we go through this, though, note that we're going to have to sort of add the plot to it, in a sense, because we'll have the script there, but we're going to have to sort of surmise some of the things that have happened in the meantime. And fortunately, scholars and intellectuals over thousands of years have done that a lot, and so we have a lot of area to stand on as we begin that. Let's go ahead and take a moment before we begin reading and just take a moment praying. Heavenly Father, pray that you would be at work in our hearts in this time. We are talking about some tough subjects, and Lord, a lot of us have maybe some baggage from this in the past, some bad experiences we've had, heartbreak. Father, today, as we look at this, I pray that we'd see ourselves through your graceful eyes. And Lord, for those who haven't began this journey yet, some of the younger folks perhaps in our church, I pray that you'd give them a conviction for what your image of these relationships are. Lord, I pray that all of us, whatever our walk in life, would be more obedient to you and to the way that you want us to live in love and in community and in intimacy with one another. Help us to walk away from here not frustrated with somebody else, but instead looking deeply at ourselves and making the changes that you want in our lives. We ask this in Jesus Christ's name and merit, Lord. Amen. All right, Song of Songs, chapter 5. We're going to break this down into 4 sections today, and we're going to start with verse 1. Just as a reminder, we'll read through it, and we'll stop, we'll discuss it, and I hope that God will use that to bring this book to life for you in some new ways. Now, we're going to start off with reading from him, or he, from the shepherd. We know that there are 3 big characters in this. There's the shepherd, or the guy the shepherdess or the girl. Both of them have a shepherd's background. And then there's their friends or their community. And so I'll try to voice who's talking at each point just so we don't lose track of that. He. I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. I have gathered my myrrh with my spice. I have eaten my honeycomb and my honey. I have drunk my wine and my milk. Friends, eat, friends, and drink. Drink your fill of love. Okay, so as I said, this is sort of a conclusion to chapter 4. And in chapter 4, we saw this poetic imagery of the wife's virtue being a garden which she had shut off, waiting for her husband, hoping someday that the right man would come into her life, that they would get married. And that has all come into a culmination. They've had their wedding day. Now they're coming into their bedroom. They're seeing each other for the first time. And he, being a gentleman, even then asks her for permission for them to be intimate. And she says yes. And here, in effect, he's saying at the beginning of chapter 5, we did that. It was a good thing. There were some beautiful aspects to it. And so, he points out all of these, using this imagery of myrrh and of honey and milk, all of these precious commodities that would have been quite expensive and would have seemed luxurious. He's saying basically, we had that experience, and it was all of that. It was wonderful. Now, it's interesting to note that the community gives a response to it. And so at the final part of verse 1 there, we see their friends or their community saying, eat, friends, and drink. Drink your fill of love. And in fact, they're giving their encouragement in this. This is a good thing. You guys, you did this God's way. You've submitted it to him. You've asked him into this relationship. You're married now. And now you guys should enjoy everything that there is to enjoy with this. And that's one of the things we talked about last week as we went into that. Now, as we pick up at verse 2, I want to point out, as has often been the case, that there is going to be a bit of time lapse that happens between. You're going to notice that the settings are changed. These two were in a bedroom together, and as this next section starts at verse 2, we're going to see they're actually apart from each other. And so I just want you to brace yourself for that. We know that this is happening later on in the relationship. They're both newlyweds. We don't know if this was a month later or a week later or a year later or what. But time is going to go by, and relationship dynamics are going to change a little bit. And through that, these guys are going to have a challenge that comes out of that. So let's go ahead now and pick up at verse 2 and read through verse 6 and see how things change. We'll read it and then we'll break it down. I slept, but my heart was awake. Listen, my beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my flawless one. My head is drenched with dew, my hair with the dampness of night. I have taken off my robe. Must I put it on again? I have washed my feet. Must I soil them again? My beloved thrust his hand through the latch opening. My heart began to pound for him. I arose to open for my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with flowing myrrh on the handles of the bolt. I opened for my beloved, but my beloved had left. He was gone. My heart sank at his departure. I looked for him, but did not find him. I called him, but he did not answer. Okay, so as the shepherdess is here, we have a new setting set. She is at home. It seems to be late in the evening, and he is gone. We have to ask the question, well, why would a shepherd be gone? And of course, being a shepherd, we could probably make some occupational guesses from that. Sometimes sheep get lost and need to be chased down. You often have to have somebody watching the sheep 24 hours. You can't just leave them out in the pasture to fend for themselves, or us predators, especially nocturnal predators, will go ahead and capture them. And so this shepherd, for whatever reason, was out working, and he was out working late. But late at night, he comes home, and he knocks on the door and tries to get his wife's attention. And we can see there, the part in quotations is her quoting him and what he said. So the initial part of verse 2, he says, open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my flawless one. My head is drenched with dew, my hair with the dampness of night. In other words, I'm out here, sweetheart, I really want to come in. I love you, I miss you. It's raining. Can you open the door? Now, in the ancient world, doors didn't function quite the same as they do today. Of course, most of you, if you lock your home when you're gone, which probably most of us do, you go in, you slip in a key, and you can lock and unlock it that way. In the ancient world, in most of the cases, actually, the door would only lock from the inside. But if it was unlockable from the outside, then typically there would be a little doorway you reach through in order to manipulate the locking mechanism. Often that door would be there whether or not it was possible to unlock the door from the outside. And for most people, you would have typically had somebody at home, and often at night especially, they would have wanted to lock the door anyway. Many of you might do that too, lock your door at night because you don't want some random stranger wandering in. But in this case, we see he reaches through, perhaps trying to get the door mechanism to unlock, but he's waiting for her, and ultimately, she hesitates. In fact, we see in her description, she begins to talk about how, in a sense, frustrated she is with the situation. Just at the end of the quotation, starting at verse 3, she says, "I've taken off my robe. Must I put it on again? I've washed my feet. Must I soil them again?" And so, in effect, she's saying, man, I already got my pajamas on. I already crawled into bed, and now he's knocking at the door. It's the middle of the night. I'm warm and cozy here, and now he expects me to get up, put on a robe, walk out to the door, unlock it. And most people would have had a dirt floor back then, so her feet are going to be dirty. She's going to have to wash them before she gets back in bed because she doesn't want that grime in the bed. And so she's thinking through all of this, and it's making her hesitant. And so rather than rush to the door when her husband unexpectedly comes home, she hesitates. And apparently, she hesitates just long enough that he decides from outside, well, apparently she's not coming. I wonder if I did something wrong. Did I upset her? Maybe she's not as happy about our marriage as I am. Maybe I don't know. But he waits for a few minutes, and then he takes off. And she does finally, starting to get excited about him being home and getting past the sort of lethargic feeling of sleep and the dread of having to get out from under the warm covers. She decides, I'll go out there. She opens the door, but when she opens the door, he's already left. And we can see her response isn't, well, good riddance. She's not happy about that situation. In fact, quite the opposite. She's thinking, oh my gosh, he left. He must have thought I wasn't coming. He must have thought I didn't care to actually open the door for him, that I was going to leave him outside all night. And so she hollers for him, looks around, she can't see him anywhere, she calls to him, he doesn't answer. He's already taken off. He's already given up on this. Now I want to mention, as you guys read that, in the English and in the Hebrew, you might notice that there's some areas there where there's some double meanings to things, where there's some sexual innuendos woven into it. I'll let you guys read it yourself and go back and explore that a little bit. But that's not accidental. It's there in the Hebrew too. And one of the implications here is that he's coming home in the middle of the night, and he's going to be happy to see his wife, and she would be happy to see him, but he, like many young married men, might have something in particular on his mind and when he comes to visit his wife. And there is an undertone of that. Now, of course, consent is essential in these relationships, and they should be happy to see each other just on the surface of that. But we don't ever get a point to see what happens on that front because there's this lag that happens. She isn't quick to give up, and he's quick to believe that maybe she doesn't think that highly of him. And so they part ways. Now, let's see how things develop from here. She's out there at the door, not sure what to do, scared that she's hurt his feelings. So now we'll read verses 7 through 9. And we'll see how things progress. The watchmen found me as they made their rounds in the city. They beat me. They bruised me. They took away my cloak. Those watchmen of the walls. Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you, if you find my beloved, what will you tell him? Tell him I am faint with love. Friends, how is your beloved better than others? Most beautiful of women. How is your beloved better than others, that you so charge us? Okay, so two big things here. She initially gives her account. She goes out to look for her husband, but he's already left. She's panicked about it. And as we can see here, it's because she loves him, because she actually cares about him. Her actions might not have quickly demonstrated that, but deep down in her heart, she doesn't want him hurt. She doesn't want him thinking, I don't have any use for you. Then that's not the intention of all. And so she rushes out through the streets at night. Now, it's good to note that in the ancient world, it's a major no-no for, in particular, women to be roaming around in the streets in the middle of the night. Part of that is it's difficult to actually provide protection for that. The second part is it was a common time and means for prostitutes of the era to use. And so a woman wearing her robe, running around the streets in the middle of the night, it could be very easy for a watchman to see that girl and think, oh boy, she's up to no good. She must be going from place to place visiting customers tonight, and that's not allowed. Now, also, and this isn't a evaluative judgment of whether this is right or not, but in the ancient world, it was also not uncommon for the local law enforcement to be able to use corporal punishment at will. So their response to that was to think, I don't know what she's doing out here. We don't really know her, but she must be up to no good. Let's beat her a little bit and hope she doesn't do it a second time. Obviously, not at all acceptable, and certainly not in our society, but in the ancient world, this was actually mild for what it could have been. And so she receives a beating, and yet not so bad that she can't continue onward. Then she does continue onward. And she's still not concerned about that, which most of us would be, about the physical hostility we just experienced, but more concerned about my husband's still out here. Where is he? He's going to be out here somewhere on the streets. He might be walking around here thinking, my wife thinks I'm useless. She wants nothing to do with me. She's given up on the relationship, apparently, because she won't even answer the door when I come. And going through all that, she's looking for him. Now, what is interesting here, and even odd, I would say, is the response of the friends. Because in that moment, she calls out, in effect, to her friends, to women in the community, and she asks them, if you see him, what are you going to tell him? Because they could weigh in on this discussion, right? They could say, you know what? He knows you think he's useless. He knows you don't want anything to do with him. And of course, that wouldn't be true, but from what she's describing, and yet she's worried that might be the case. And she says specifically at the end of verse 8, tell him I'm faint with love. Tell him I feel physically weakened because I'm so in love with him and because I've let this bad thing happen. So let him know that. Now, the friends, in return, ask an odd question of her, and I think we need to explore this, because if you're like me, this might strike you as weird to begin with, but there's a deeper principle underneath it that her community is trying to direct her to. So verse 9, it says, how is your beloved better than others, most beautiful of women? How is your beloved better than others that you so charge us? This is a weird comment or question for them to ask, because as you guys might recall, as we've gone through Song of Songs so far, the community has been highly supportive of these two people. I mean, they've talked about how they were both of good integrity. They were both good, honest people. The community was excited that they were dating. They were excited that they were getting married. They weren't even excited that they enjoyed some of the natural outpourings of marriage. And they were cheering them along all the way along in the journey. And yet at this point, they're asking, what's so special about him? Why are you so concerned about it? Now, the question I would propose to you reveals the people in the community see a shortcoming here. And the shortcoming is, you guys haven't been very encouraging to each other as of late. When you were really slow to get up, and he was really slow to believe, or really quick to believe that you had no use for him. How did we get there? And so they ask the question, what's so good about your husband? What's great about him? Why is he so special to you? And in fact, there's the implication that this is the very question you should have been answering beforehand. This is an important thing to do in your relationship. So we're here, and this isn't an indictment only of women. This is a thing men are just as quick or quicker to do. But there is this issue of, are you actually speaking life, or are you actually speaking encouragement into your relationship? If somebody asked your spouse how you feel about them, would they say, they put up with me? Or they say, we actually like each other. We have a happy relationship. So Let's continue on, and we'll see her response to that question. What's so special about this guy? Why do you like him? Verse 10 through 16, we'll see her describe that. Then we're going to come back and talk about how to apply this to our lives. My beloved is radiant and ruddy, outstanding among 10,000. His head is purest gold. His hair is wavy and black as a raven. His eyes are like doves by the streams of water, washed in milk, mounted like jewels. His cheeks are like beds of spice, yielding perfume. His lips are like lilies, dripping with myrrh. His arms are rods of gold set with topaz. His body is like polished ivory, decorated with lapis lazuli. His legs are pillars of marble set on bases of pure gold. His appearance is like Lebanon, choice as its cedars. His mouth is sweetness itself. He is altogether lovely. This is my beloved. This is my friend, daughters of Jerusalem. Okay, so lots of imagery here. Let's just discuss a little bit of it to give you a notion of what we're talking about. So to begin with, she says he's radiant and he's ruddy. So this is talking about his personality. He has this radiant, bright, life-giving sort of personality. Ruddy, that means there's a redness or a color to his face. So he looks very lively and alive. And so she's talking about these elements. Let's see here. He's outstanding among 10,000. If you put him among 10,000 people, we could easily pick him out because I just think he's that special. She talks about his hair, about his face being tanned in the next verse. His hair is black and it's wavy, and she thinks it's beautiful in color. Verse 12, she says his eyes are like doves. This is apparently a common pickup line in the ancient world because we've seen this 3 times so far. His eyes are like doves, but it escalates this time. They're by streams of water to where there's this beautiful backdrop, and also like they were washed in milk. Now, as we said before, with doves, they're used in the temple for sacrifice, so there's this sense of innocence to them, though only the purest, whitest doves would be used there. That's what most Israelites would think of. But in this case, they're not just white. They were just washed in milk, which is about as white a thing as you would see in the ancient world. And the color is referring to the whites of his eyes. They look healthy and look lively and innocent. And so she sees this as one of his attributes. And his eyes, she say, look like they're jewels that are mounted on his cheeks. And she goes on to describe him, and we won't dive into every single metaphor there, but he's very solid like marble. He has big muscles like they're big gems. I mean, she talks just about how stout he is, how strong he is, that he has these alluring smells that emanate off of him like the most expensive spices that are out there. She still really likes him. That's the basic point. And she even ends out by saying to her friends, it's not just that, but he's my friend. I mean, even beyond the fact that physically I find him really attractive, he's my good friend. And those are the things that I appreciate about him. Now, she can say these things to her friends, but for whatever reason in this relationship, this hasn't been talked about a lot. And what I want to suggest to you today is that in our marriages, in our dating relationships, even in our friendships a lot of times, we tend to treat them a whole lot like my buddies and I did the cockroach. It was actually a pretty good thing. It was a good car to have, but all I could see was the bad stuff around it. And if that's all you choose to focus on, then that's all you're going to see. And there is this strange truth when it comes to relationships and to the world in general. You can't decide what everything around you is going to be and make it so. I know that there's this new agey notion that if you stand out on the freeway and say you don't believe in semis anymore, that you can't get run over by one. But that's sincerely not true, right? I would imagine nobody wants to test that theory today. Now, and while you can't change reality by thinking about it differently, you can choose what you focus on, can't you? In every relationship you have, you can decide whether to focus on the positive or the negative. And here in this passage, we see a warning. Right, for this couple who's been so in love with each other, who's been so swept away in these emotions, there's some time after they get married and they experience all the joys that come with that, they get to a point where they're not sharing encouragement with each other enough. And in this passage, we see the woman is the one who's in a sense, the fault is being put at the foot of. But again, this happens universally in relationships. It's a risk universally in relationships, and I don't think there's one gender that's more prone to it than another. The principle is still there. If she had been more encouraging to her husband, is it possible that her mental framework, her mindset when he came out in the middle of the night might have been a little bit cheerier? Has she been vocalizing and focusing on the good things about him? Maybe she wouldn't have thought, I really don't want to get up right now. That's her first thought when he showed up. And further than that, had she voiced some of those things to him and spoken life and encouragement into their relationship, is it possible that he would have stayed at the door a little bit longer? That maybe he wouldn't have been so quick to believe, she must think I'm useless. Apparently she doesn't want to see me. I thought this was going to be a special thing where I get to come home when I wasn't supposed to be able to tonight, but I'm locked out. I'll just go mope along down the streets and go find somewhere else to be. It's interesting that the things that we focus on in our relationships have a great power in steering them. And this week, the challenge I want to give you guys, in your friendships and in your dating relationships, for that matter, for those of you who are married, I want to especially focus on your marriages, but those of you who aren't, encourage you, your friendships, this principle still applies. Frankly, parents, this applies to your kids. Encouragement is a powerful thing. There's that old saying that you'll attract more flies with honey than with vinegar, right? And fundamentally, we can see that that's true. You can set some out on your patio and see what happens if the flies are actually out and about right now. But in principle, we get that. And yet, in our relationships, so often we choose to focus on the negative things. We fixate on them. Now, as I'm talking about this, let me say too, I know some of you are here today, and you might say, Pastor, you don't know my spouse. It's really tough to come up with a few things. I'd suggest to you, you need to work at it. You need to work at it. You can make a decision to find things that are positive in just about any person. You can find something positive to say just about anyone, about just about anyone if you choose to. And it's a discipline that'll be helpful in bringing life to your relationship. But we can get into a spiral really quick. As this couple clearly loves each other, as we've read this book. They still have strong feelings for each other, but because they haven't been positive enough, already something is tearing apart their relationship. And it's going to be a few chapters before we actually see a full mending of the brokenness that happened there. So your homework this week, should you choose to accept it, the base level of it is for you to go either to your spouse or to a close friend and make a point of actually saying some positive things to them. Think about it for a little while before you get there. Don't try to just make it up on the fly or it won't come across as sincere. Think about things that you appreciate about them. With a friend, you might say, man, I appreciate that you were there for me when I walked through this bad situation. I appreciate that you listened to me even when I talk too much. There's so many things that you can come up with, right? That you can, and the fact is, with your friends, you're choosing to spend time around them, so you must think they're okay. If you despise them, you can walk away anytime you want. It's a strange thing. But choose one of those things, focus on it, and even better yet, for either marriages or friendships, write it down. Writing down your thoughts and putting them on a page has a great power to it. They can encourage people several times over. They can take it and they can read it and know that there are things you appreciate about them and actually have that to meditate on. And final step, if you really want to do the advanced homework, especially for the married couples here, I want to encourage you guys, write the note, take them out on a date, and then actually hand it to them. Actually take that step in being proactive. This seems like such a small principle, but I can see time and time again in relationships where I'm talking to people and two people have just come to a point where they've decided I'm going to point out every despicable thing about the person in front of me. And anything they do, I'm going to interpret it as despicable because I've made that decision. I've decided they're a bad person. And we've got to be so cautious of that because that will destroy a relationship. But on the flip side of that, if you are somebody who's constantly speaking encouragement and building up your wife, your kids, your friends, those relationships are just going to solidify and grow more. And of course, intuitively, we know this in terms of being recipients of it, right? If there's somebody in your life right now who every time you meet them, they criticize you, are you eager to go spend time with them? No, obviously not. But on the flip side of that, if you have people who see the good things about you and are willing to put words to it, then of course, then you're willing to. And here we see there's a real power in this. And to be honest, as a pastor, I see this frequently poisoning relationships when it's not being done as discipline. And let me say to the guys in particular today, you might think, Pastor, I've told my wife plenty of times I love her. I've told her plenty of times that I care about her. Don't settle on that. Do it more, okay? Whenever I perform a marriage, I always give 2 challenges to the couple that I'm marrying. And those of you who I've been blessed to get to be involved in that for you, you'll know what they are. But to every guy or to every girl, I challenge them to do their best to be their husband's biggest cheerleader, to be the person speaking encouragement in their life more than anyone else. And I do that because in my experience, we men, we really don't like to admit it, but oftentimes we're scared or we feel inadequate to the task that's at hand. And there are a few things that are more powerful than the women in our lives actually coming into that situation and providing us encouragement. We don't want to admit the power that's there, but it's a big thing. You can turn one of us into a Superman if you actually speak that life into us. And for men, the challenge that I always give, and this relates to what we're talking about today, is to work to love your wives more than they love you. And I'm a firm believer that God has hardwired most women to be innately better at showing love than most men are. But here's the nice part. Even if you never win by showing more love to them than they've shown to you, you'll always win. You'll always come out ahead. We need to have as a community of Christ, we need to have relationships where encouragement is a big part of the way that we live, where we're as graceful with each other as Jesus is with us. And Jesus could come down and he could have a talk with us and point out every wrong thing we've ever done in our lives. But instead, he's always calling us forward to the good things he sees in us, to the potential he sees there, to what's ahead. We need to live that same way in our relationships. If we do, we'll have God in the middle of them, and it'll be apparent to those around us that that's what's going on. At this time, I'm going to ask one of our leaders to come forward to lead us in our communion and offering meditations. As they do, I'll also ask our deacons to come forward and ask you to join me for a moment of prayer. Lord, we have a culture that fixates on complaint. And far too often, we do the same thing. Lord, we know that you have put many good things in our life, and probably we don't know what half of them are because we don't have that gratitude. But I pray today that you would give us hearts of gratitude. I pray that you would bless our friendships, that you would bless our parent and child relationships. I pray that you'd bless our marriages, Lord. Help us to speak life and encouragement into those situations. Lord, we thank you for the many good blessings you give us. And we pray that you'd keep them in our life in a greater proportion to our gratitude, because it rarely reaches as high as the good you've done. We love you, and we turn these things over to you in the name and merit of Jesus Christ. Amen.